Nancy Wake was the most wanted woman in Nazi-occupied Europe, and yet the Gestapo never managed to catch her even once. At the height of the war, her face was circulated across secret police networks. Her name was extracted from prisoners under torture. And an enormous bounty was placed on her head, higher than that offered for any other Allied agent during the entire Second World War. Dozens of trained hunters were assigned to track her movements, infiltrate her networks, and close the trap. But every time they believed they had her cornered, she disappeared again, leaving behind sabotage, dead soldiers, and destroyed infrastructure. That was why the Germans began calling her the White Mouse, because like a ghost, she slipped through their fingers again and again while the war around them slowly turned against them.
What makes this story even more disturbing is not just what Nancy Wake did, but what she looked like while doing it. She did not resemble a soldier, a spy, or a hardened assassin. She looked like someone who belonged in the front row of a Paris fashion show. She wore elegant dresses, red lipstick, and carried a pistol hidden inside her handbag next to her makeup. She laughed at parties with collaborators, danced with men who would later hunt her, and gathered information while pretending to be harmless. The Nazis made one of the most dangerous mistakes in intelligence history. They assumed that a beautiful woman could not be a strategic threat. By the time they realized how wrong they were, entire German units had already been wiped out by resistance forces she trained and led. This story matters today because it destroys the illusion that power belongs only to armies, technology, or governments. Nancy Wake proved that determination, intelligence, and psychological warfare can be more powerful than tanks or aircraft. She showed that one person, if driven by purpose, can reshape events on a scale normally reserved for nations. And the most chilling part is that her transformation did not begin on a battlefield, but in a quiet European street long before the war officially started. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born on August 30th, 1892, in Wellington, New Zealand, as the youngest of 6 children in a complicated and divided household. Her father, Charles Wake, was a journalist who valued curiosity and independence, while her mother, Ella, was deeply religious and strict, believing that discipline and obedience were the only acceptable path for a young woman. Their personalities could not have been more different, and Nancy grew up caught between those two worlds. When she was still a child, the family moved to Australia, but stability did not last. Her father abandoned the family when Nancy was only 12 years old, leaving her mother to raise the children alone. This event hardened Nancy and planted in her a deep refusal to depend on anyone for survival. At 16, she ran away from home and took work as a nurse, saving every possible coin with a clear goal in mind. She wanted freedom, adventure, and a life far beyond the expectations imposed on her. By the time she turned 20, she had enough money to buy a one-way ticket to the United States. She left Australia behind and never looked back. In New York during the 1930s, she found herself in a city defined by crime, economic collapse, and opportunity. Rather than being intimidated, Nancy was energized by the danger. She began working as a journalist for newspapers owned by William Randolph Hearst, covering corruption, organized crime, and violent incidents that most reporters avoided. She learned how power operated behind closed doors, how lies were constructed, and how fear controlled societies. In 1933, she was sent to Europe to report on political developments, and it was there that she witnessed events that would permanently alter the course of her life. In Vienna, she saw Nazi forces consolidating power, but what shocked her was not the uniforms or speeches. It was the everyday brutality. She watched Jewish families dragged into the streets while crowds remained silent. She saw a man beaten to death in broad daylight, while authorities did nothing. On one occasion, she saw an elderly man publicly whipped by an SS officer because he failed to move quickly enough off the sidewalk. The casual cruelty, the indifference of witnesses, and the normalization of violence burned into her memory. In that moment, Nancy made a decision that would define everything that followed. If war came, she would not remain neutral, and she would not simply observe. She would fight. Before we continue, remember that this video is not free. The price is simple. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment, because this tells the algorithm you want more stories like this and allows us to keep producing them. By the late 1930s, Nancy had settled in Paris, where she built a new life that appeared completely disconnected from the darkness spreading across Europe. She married a wealthy industrialist, Henri Fiocca, and entered elite French society. She attended political gatherings, social events, and private dinners, where influential figures discussed the future of Europe. While many believed diplomacy would prevent catastrophe, Nancy sensed that war was inevitable. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, her fears were confirmed. Within months, France collapsed, and the occupation began. In that moment, Nancy Wake made another decision, one that transformed her from an observer of history into one of its most dangerous participants. She began quietly, helping downed Allied pilots escape across borders, forging documents, and hiding refugees. But the network grew rapidly, and with each successful operation, the Gestapo moved closer. What they did not yet understand was that this elegant woman in silk dresses had already become one of their most lethal enemies. Soon, the price on her head would rise, and her war would become far more violent, personal, and relentless than anyone could imagine. At the moment when the first ships began moving into the open sea, it became clear that this was no longer just an operation, but a fight for survival, where every mistake could cost thousands of lives. The commanders understood that they had almost no time for hesitation because the enemy had already started adjusting its strategy, while intelligence reports were arriving with dangerous delays. Communication was unstable. Radio interceptions provided only fragments of information, and many decisions had to be made almost blindly, relying on experience, instinct, and cold calculation. Inside headquarters, a heavy silence dominated the atmosphere, broken only by short, sharp orders and the fast footsteps of signal officers moving between rooms. The maps spread across the tables were already outdated, because the situation on the ground was changing faster than they could be updated. The leadership realized that if they failed at this stage, the consequences would not be limited to a single front, but could affect the entire course of the war. That was why they made a choice that only days earlier would have been considered reckless. They decided to act aggressively, impose their own tempo, and force the enemy to react instead of plan. This decision, however, demanded extraordinary discipline from every soldier and officer involved. Any panic, any loss of control, could destroy the entire plan. Morale became the central factor. Commanders personally visited units, spoke directly with the men, explained why this mission mattered, and how the outcome depended on every individual. Many veterans later remembered those conversations for the rest of their lives, because in that moment, they truly felt that they were part of something historic. Meanwhile, the enemy was far from passive. Its intelligence services began to notice unusual movements, but analysts could not immediately determine what it meant. Some believed it was only a diversion, while others warned that a major strike was coming. These arguments continued for too long, and that hesitation proved decisive. By the time the threat became obvious, precious time had already been lost. The first clashes were brutal and chaotic. The plan that had seemed clear and logical on paper collided with weather, exhaustion, confusion, and the unpredictable nature of real combat. Some units lost direction. Others came under fire earlier than expected. Yet it was precisely in these moments that leadership revealed itself. Officers on the ground took initiative, adjusted routes, regrouped scattered forces, and kept moving forward despite casualties and uncertainty. Speed quickly became the defining element of the operation. The command constantly emphasized that success depended less on strength and more on tempo. They had to outpace the enemy's decision-making cycle, disrupt its command structure, and create a sense of chaos. Every hour of delay would allow the opponent to regroup, reinforce, and turn the situation into a prolonged battle they could not afford. At one critical moment, the entire effort came close to collapse. One of the key sectors was suddenly threatened, and if it fell, the whole operation could unravel. Communication with forward units was lost, and headquarters had no clear picture of whether the line still held. The tension during those hours was unbearable. Many later described it as the most difficult period of the entire campaign. The decision that followed required immense courage, because it was based on incomplete and uncertain information. The leadership chose to commit their last reserves. This meant there would be no backup plan, no second chance. It was a true point of no return. If the strike succeeded, they would seize the initiative. If it failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. The order was given, and the troops advanced once again, driven by duty, exhaustion, and the determination not to fail. What happened next would later be called the turning point. The unexpected pressure forced the enemy to begin withdrawing in several sectors. Its defensive system wasn't prepared for such speed and relentless momentum. Local commanders began making rushed decisions, which only increased confusion and disorder. Within days, the entire situation started to shift, yet victory was still far from certain. The enemy retained significant forces and was preparing a counterattack. The command understood that there could be no moment of relaxation. They immediately began planning the next phase, which had to transform this fragile success into a strategic advantage. And this is where the story becomes even more intense, because the decisions made in the following days would not only shape the outcome of the operation, but would also change the course of the war itself. As the next phase began, The commanders knew they had entered the most dangerous stage of the entire campaign. Momentum was now on their side, but history had shown many times that early success could create overconfidence, and overconfidence could lead to disaster. The enemy was wounded, not defeated. It was reorganizing, moving reserves, and preparing a counterstrike that could reverse everything in a matter of days. Every decision now carried even greater weight than before. Logistics became the hidden battlefield. Supplies had to move faster than ever, across damaged roads, destroyed bridges, and territory that had only recently been under enemy control. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical support were no longer secondary concerns. Without them, even the strongest army could collapse. Officers responsible for supply chains worked without sleep, improvising solutions, rerouting convoys, and using every available resource. Many later said that the success of the operation depended as much on these unseen efforts as on combat itself. At the front, soldiers felt the pressure increasing. They understood that the enemy would soon strike back. Patrols reported growing resistance, new defensive positions, and signs of reinforcements. Yet instead of slowing down, the command pushed for even greater speed. The logic was simple and brutal. If they stopped, they would lose the initiative. If they continued, they might break the enemy's ability to respond altogether. Psychological warfare also played a major role. Rumors were deliberately spread to exaggerate the strength and numbers of advancing forces. False radio traffic suggested operations in areas where no attack was planned. The goal was to stretch the enemy's defenses, force it to divide its attention, and create uncertainty. Confusion at the highest levels of command began to spread. Analysts struggled to distinguish real threats from deception. Then came the counterattack everyone had feared. It was sudden, powerful, and carefully timed. Enemy forces struck at the most vulnerable sector, hoping to cut supply lines and isolate forward units. For a brief moment, the entire advance appeared to be in danger. Some formations were pushed back. Communication again became unstable, and reports from the battlefield were contradictory and alarming. In those critical hours, leadership once again proved decisive. Rather than retreat, the command chose a bold and risky response. They redirected forces from less threatened sectors and launched a rapid, concentrated strike against the flanks of the attacking enemy. This move required perfect coordination and absolute trust in officers on the ground. There was no time for detailed planning. Speed and initiative replaced caution. The clash that followed was intense and exhausting. Both sides fought with determination, fully aware that the outcome could shape the rest of the war. Soldiers later described these battles as some of the most brutal they had ever experienced. Yet gradually, the pressure began to shift. The enemy's attack lost momentum. Its units became stretched and exposed. The counterstroke achieved its goal. With the immediate threat neutralized, the operation entered its final phase. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now transforming into a strategic breakthrough. The command moved quickly to consolidate gains, secure key positions, and prepare defenses against further attacks. Every kilometer gained was reinforced, every vulnerable point strengthened. The broader impact soon became clear. The enemy was forced to abandon long-term plans and redirect resources to stabilize the front. This shift weakened its position in other regions, creating opportunities that had not existed before. Allies gained confidence, while neutral observers began to reconsider the balance of power. The psychological effect was as important as the territorial gains. Looking back, historians would later debate which factor had mattered most: speed, leadership, morale, or intelligence. But those who were there often gave a simpler answer. They said the true difference was the refusal to accept failure. At every moment when the situation seemed impossible, someone made the decision to continue, to act, and to take responsibility. And that is why this story remains relevant today. It shows that history is not only shaped by numbers, technology, or resources. It is shaped by human choices made under pressure, in uncertainty, and in moments when the future is unclear. The individuals who take those decisions rarely know whether they will be remembered. They only know that inaction is the greatest risk of all. In the end, the operation did more than secure victory in a single campaign. It changed the strategic balance, accelerated the collapse of enemy resistance, and proved that initiative and determination could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. And for those who lived through it, the memory of those days would remain with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder of how close the world had come to a very different outcome. By the time the war in Europe was drawing to a close, the cost had been immense, but the results were undeniable. Entire cities, once under enemy control, were liberated, and thousands of lives that might have been lost were saved through the courage and leadership demonstrated during the operation. The enemy had been decisively weakened, its plans disrupted, and its morale shattered. Yet the story was far from over for those who had risked everything on the front lines. For many, the aftermath meant facing the physical and psychological toll of relentless combat, loss, and exhaustion. Among the heroes was a woman whose name would become legendary: Nancy Wake. She had operated behind enemy lines, leading resistance groups, organizing sabotage missions, and coordinating supply drops under constant threat of capture or death. She had become one of the most effective and feared agents of the Allied forces, yet she never sought fame or recognition. Her work had been measured in lives saved, infrastructure disrupted, and missions completed with precision. Every operation required split-second decisions, ingenuity, and an unwavering commitment to the cause. Nancy's ability to lead and inspire under the most extreme conditions set her apart from even the most experienced military officers. By May of 1945, as Germany surrendered and Europe began the slow process of recovery, the true scale of her achievements became apparent. The resistance networks she had trained and supported had not only survived, but had inflicted significant damage on enemy forces. Bridges destroyed, supply lines severed, and convoys ambushed. Each success contributed directly to weakening the enemy and shortening the war. Her leadership had multiplied the impact of ordinary citizens turned fighters, transforming local resistance into a formidable strategic asset. Yet the personal cost was staggering. Friends and loved ones had died, including her husband, taken and executed by enemy forces in an effort to break her spirit. Despite the grief and trauma, Nancy continued her mission with the same determination she had shown from the very beginning. She understood that the war demanded relentless commitment, and she had proven that courage and intelligence could achieve what sheer force alone could not. Her story became a testament to the power of will, resourcefulness, and moral conviction in the face of overwhelming adversity. After the war, Nancy Wake was recognized with numerous honors and medals by multiple allied nations, but she remained humble. She rarely spoke of her accomplishments, preferring to focus on the lives saved and the battles won by the teams she had led. Her legacy endured not through fame, but through the history of resistance, the liberation of towns, and the countless survivors who owed their freedom to her courage. She returned to civilian life, but the skills, discipline, and resolve forged during wartime continued to shape her identity. The lessons of Nancy Wake's actions resonate even today. They remind us that extraordinary outcomes often arise from the dedication of individuals willing to confront danger, innovate under pressure, and persist when failure seems inevitable. History is shaped not only by armies, generals, or machines, but by those who are willing to take decisive action when circumstances demand it. Courage, intelligence, and relentless determination can tip the balance, even against overwhelming odds. As the war ended and the world began to rebuild, the story of Nancy Wake became a symbol of resistance, skill, and human resilience. Her Maquis, her missions, and her courage ensured that enemy forces were never able to dominate completely. She had transformed from a socialite into a strategist, from an observer into a decisive force in one of history's greatest conflicts. And though the battles and sacrifices left scars that never fully healed, her life stands as proof that individual resolve, when paired with skill and vision, can alter the course of history.